Protect yourself from enemies. Win allies, but no sensible allies will have contingency plans, even against you, as you should against them. Make yourself loved and feared. Oh boy, fucking Trump. Have the backing of the military. Oh, fucking Trump. Oh, what did he call them today? Dopes. Wipe out those who can do you harm. Renovate ancient institutions with new ones. Be severe and kind. Magnanimous and generous. Be polarizing with power, but be careful here. Other powers could either help you or injure you, at which point you must conquer them. Men mostly do harm out of fear or hatred. And be not fooled, men and women put into positions of power or of new benefit does not shorten their memory of old injuries suffered at your hand. It is a tough road, will likely end in your demise before you get there, yet if you do prevail, you are compelled to continually enact violence and wicked acts against any emergent power, be it bureaucracy, the lower classes, politicians, or unions. It grates me just saying that. Power is held, of course, but as Machiavelli would say, this is not virtuous nor glorious, totalitarian or fascistic. It wins no favour, and indeed breeds the grounds of one's own demise. The fight, the execution of one's potential enemies must be done swiftly if one is to survive for long. These attacks and wicked plots, even killing one's own family members in the process, have to be framed as necessary, in service of the utility or honour of the greater good. In other words, it would be better to provoke an attack on you, make it look like you are merely defending yourself, false flags and all that. Phrases like preemptive strikes to protect our interest start appearing in the media. And from that, perhaps you might even be able to make arguments, well, maybe not arguments, but propaganda at least, to post hoc justify the evil act as the start of some liberation effort or other good cause. One example of this currently popular is playing the victim card. Someone may make a statement that is actually egregious and does harm, but rather than back down or correct, they'll take a stance like, oh, I'm the most hated person in the UK because these trolls just can't stand what I say. We mentioned previously about carrying out airstrikes or laying off workers in a recession or a downsize. Do it once, accept an almost burdensome amount of collateral damage to ensure the target is met. Doing it once and missing shows incompetence and causes great pain and suffering, and for no good reason or any justifiable reason. Dare you try again, you look vindictive, petty and incompetent. We said it before, you can always hire back in the case of excessive first round redundancies in a downsize, but a second round or a third round of redundancies is destructive for morale. The spectre of the next round is always in the minds of the people. And even if you really do mean it this time, that last time was the last time for redundancies, they know you will mean otherwise. It's very difficult for people to be long-term thinking with that hanging over their heads, and it all switches to self-serving short-interest decisions. The whole mindset shifts. So yeah, if you have to do harm out of necessity, of course, do it quickly, swiftly and sufficiently. Do not fuck around here. It's not to be savoured. Benefits, on the other hand, are to be drip-fed so that they can be savoured. Give it all away at once, and where do you go from there? And consistency is key. The prince must be unwavering. Good conditions, bad conditions, neither shall influence your actions to be extra wicked under the circumstances or extra beneficial to win favour. It will not. Defence needs consistency, needs plans for everything, and therefore there is a need to be aware of all the things going on. And here, institutional or generational knowledge is imperative to have access to people who were at the cutting edge of negotiations 20, 30, even 40 years ago to give advices today, not only the methods, but also to give insight on what's changed and what that means today, so that today's negotiators and diplomats can account for history. Again, it comes back to having that kind of respect and understanding from where people have come from. It's an appreciation of what's gone before and how they got here, and what that has cost, or what price they had to pay, or the difficulties of the time must be appreciated. So one has to ask questions about competency when the prince or elected king is writing off strategic partners. The insight here is strategic. The partners in a strategic plan are, well, required for the plan to work, strategically. Running them off means to change all those plans. It's in opposition to Iger's notion of setting goals by public announcement, which holds him to account and gives confidence in the company employees to shoot for that goal. What is the effect of doing the opposite, where the General-in-Chief makes destructive public proclamations? Surely it's the opposite effect. No one is held accountable. The goal is incoherent. Decisions become based on irrational thought. Plans are destroyed. Long-term goals evaporate. Partners lose confidence. Expansion plans are shelved. And here we are. The consequences of this ripple out almost immeasurably. It's worth pointing out, allies and strategic partners are groups and peoples that have some temporarily aligned values and goals. And there are a whole bunch of those goals that are not aligned, but for the moment the advantage of the aligned common values and goals perhaps outweighs all those non-aligned ones. So if the goals and values were identical or were the same, they would be on your side. Piss them off and alienate them makes it difficult for them to reach those common goals, and it may be easier and more worthwhile for them now to abandon the strategic partnerships to pursue those other goals with other allies. What did Machiavelli say? Never empower the enemy. Besides, our goals, their goals, are going to change over time as the world changes. And as pointed out in the Bob Iger series, and noticing all the factors that have to come together to make a film, frankly, I'm friggin' amazed that it happens at all. Of course, this is a kind of fallacy of looking back at things. It's like that fallacy of the chances of you being born. Well, to kind of be a well-formed question, it would need to have the same validity were the question asked before you were born, which makes no sense. The fact that the event gives rise to the question is a kind of circular reasoning. You know, it's like saying, imagine a die, roll it, what number did you get? Fascinating. Did I mention that it was a 12-sided die? So you don't know what the starting conditions are, you don't know what the possibilities are, so how can you possibly say what the chances of you being born are before you were born? It's only afterwards that when the die landed on 7, you can go, oh look, it was a 7. Well, what's the chances of it landing on a 7? Well, if you have a six-sided die, none. So, yeah, it's a malformed question. Anyway, diversions aside, yeah. War is a failure of diplomacy, and when diplomacy is focused on besting your own domestic political adversaries, win bigly, rather than furthering the national interests, it sends the message of where the loyalties of the prince lie. To complete the map, as it were, Machiavelli rounds off advice on what to do if you have come into power through wicked acts or effectively being pushed into the position by favour of the people. Machiavelli breaks down his analysis further in regard of the two cases. He considered principality, liberty or license. Under the principality, the nobility or common people has power depending on the circumstance. When nobility is in power, but feels the shifting sands, if they are smart they employ another noble who has favour with the people and rule via proxy through the popular figurehead. In this instance, where the common people realise they cannot eradicate the nobility totally, they agree to the compromise. Either way, the prince who attains power via these proxies is a puppet. He walks amongst other nobles who see him or her as an equal to whom the prince or princess is obligated. If it is the case where the prince came to power by the will of the common people, he walks alone amongst the nobility with no real power over them. And here is an interesting power dynamic. Should the prince lose favour with the people, they will just walk away from him. However, the nobility have power and resources to actively oppose. Nobles also have the time and energy to put into such endeavours, and usually utility to them is served by doing so, or maybe it's even the honourable thing to do. Yet the numbers of the peoples is large, the numbers of nobles few. The prince can't defend against all the people, there are just too many, but each of them with so little power. Neither can the people really muster to the prince's defence. However, the prince can compete directly with the other nobles, and being that there's so few of them, stands a better chance of a win. The people cannot be swapped out for new peoples. The people are the people. However, administrators and less powerful nobles can be. The prince installed by purpose of the common people, liberty or license, has one simple task. Don't piss them off, don't oppress them. The prince installed by the nobility as a compromise, if he indeed is to be his own prince and not a puppet, must win favour of the people. And then it's often a surprise to the people that such an installed prince would do good work for the people, and the peoples act out the reciprocity bias as described by Cialdini. Because they expected harm but got compassion and understanding, they are generously forgiving. Later, this reciprocity can be parlayed into actionable support by the many, such that it might just make a difference. Do not make the mistake of assuming that the people are the foundation upon which straw houses can be built. Consider the dedicated citizenry who, in good times of prosperity, would say, "We would die to protect our prince who afforded this prosperity." When bad times come, for whatever reason, that promise evaporates. And you can almost hear the ironic cry in the tone of the citizen who would say in defence of their hypocrisy, "Yeah, but that was back then when the prospect of death or demise of the prince was so remote. Now it's totally different." And they just simply won't hear logic or reason. "It will be in this moment that the prince will realise he done fucked up." I don't know whether we'll be seeing one of these in a few months. Let's see how we go. The prince must ensure that the citizens are somewhat reliant on the state, and that the prince provides the environment and conditions to ensure that state is maintained. On questions or matters of fortification, if you have independent and absolute power, you would not need fortification. Your armies and resources sufficient to quell any such attack. It's expensive, yet fortification is cheaper and will require substantial resources of an attacker to overcome. On fortification, you should keep in stock sufficient materials, resources to maintain the crafts, workmanships, and normal everyday traditions. For how long? I turn the question around and ask, for how long could an attacking force maintain their supply lines, force projection, and incredibly expensive campaign? Your reserves ought to be just a bit longer than whatever the answer to that question is. The parallels to non-cooperative business are clear. Yeah, this tends to get played out by large companies who buy up startups that might be in the future existential threats, given enough capital from other kingdoms or other funds or hedge funds or whatever. Yet the irony is, repeatedly buying up smaller, similar tech startups doesn't add much to the overall value of the buyer. Yet the market cap and domination and position in the market may give a reason justified for larger lenders to continually assign capital to this endeavour at cheap rates. You can see how bubbles form. The investment bank becomes vested in the survival of one company that's too big to fail. It has to keep buying out the competition. That becomes its business model. SoftBank looking at you. Then one day a siege starts on the prince's fortified city. Except a breakthrough technology allows them to lay siege for twice as long for twice as cheap. Now you're knackered. That might sound concerning, but at the same time, this innovation has devalued the gain of capturing the city anyway. The citizens start to leave for the promised land. The prince is left defending a ghost town. Border controls. Perhaps not to keep people out, but to keep people in. Yes, misdirection and deceit. And perhaps it's a revelation. The wise prince will keep the spirits of his citizens lifted during a siege or perceived siege. Yes, we're winning bigly. We've kept them out. Our tariffs are working. The wall is working. And the misery of the domestics is framed as a necessary sacrifice to the phantom invaders. It's a contradiction, but walls and strict borders actually increase the number of illegal immigrants. With lax borders, immigrants come in and out and back again, back in and back out, and eventually they've presumably worked up a nice little nest egg by legally, illegally, whatever, coming into the country, finding work that pays more than in their domestic town of origin, country of origin, and eventually they'll retire, go back to their homeland, spread the wealth with their family. So while the people doing this are in flux, some old boy retires, some new kid starts the process, the actual number of people toing and froing is reasonably constant. Some age out of the cycle, as I said, some younger ones come into the cycle, but when you put strict borders, those who cross in and out worry that they won't get back in if they leave, so they stay. They don't age out. And then the movement is in one direction, because people always find a way in, but they don't want to keep having to find ways in. Once they're in, and if they think that that was tough, and that the borders clamped down, they might not risk leaving on the premise that a second time or a third time they just won't get in again. So they stay, and they don't age out. Keeps people in. From one point of view, it traps cheap labour in the prince's domain, taken from neighbouring principalities. You're getting it now. The black market, labour market, supports so many economies, it's unreal. Machiavelli then discusses ecclesiastical concerns, still relevant today I suppose, and right off the bat, imagine a truce between two states where the daughter of one is married to the prince or son, or even the prince of another state, makes attack difficult, awkward, until the papacy annuls or voids that union. That aside, religious tradition is old. Princes of ecclesiastical states are subordinated to the religious institutions, as are the citizens. It's difficult to usurp a profound and fundamental and extreme belief in a deity and its dogma. The simple question that the would-be usurper will be asked is, are you greater than your creator God? Yeah, kind of buggered however you answer that one. It's either a hot rod up the jacksie or head on a spike kind of a thing. The repression of the Wombs. Witch! Should she not drown, she'd be a witch and then burned at the stake. So I had to get over the inconvenient problem of ecclesiastical power. Divide and conquer, by proxy. The prince would force a split in the nobility, and then set one half against the papacy. Where are we seeing this played out right now? Warren? Sanders? I suspect she just got a load of corporate backing. No doubt the aim of the handler would be to see them both destroyed in this process. Yeah, send a wedge in, or a third party, agitate the two parties. The other half would see the opportunity that while the Pope or third party is engaged in that battle, they would seek to recruit or install their new Pope, favourable to themselves. And this toing and froing, this side installs their Pope, that side wins, defeats the other, installs their Pope, would make the papacy seem fickle and less respected over time. People would begin to realise that the papacy is just a pawn of whoever happens to be winning the battle at any given moment. So it paints the picture of the politician or the papacy as a flip-flopper or a limp leader. Yeah, you've seen it done. Modern examples throw accusations of anti-Semitism or racism, which, by the way, have all now died down since the election in December. Fucking disgusting and dishonest. The prince, well, the long-lasting ones anyway, recognised the need and importance of good foundations to their power base. Positive motivation move towards, and the motivation of fear moves away. Do this, get good things. Don't do this, get bad things. So princes need their enforcers and rules by which a judgment of compliance or settlement of arbitration can be tested against, tried or litigated. Interesting to note, and in consideration of the UK's NHS, and I'll lay it on video now to put it on record, I have a strong notion, that I believe it to be profoundly true, that practising healthcare professionals go into practice to help people, to be of benefit, to make life better, to ease the pain and suffering, or to cure ailment where possible. Sure, of course, they get paid for it too, naturally. From hospital porters to the most niche of healthcare specialists. Same thing, I hope we agree. And to some extent, healthcare is writing a blank cheque. All sorts of problems, terminal illnesses that are just going to require constant supply of resources. It's almost limitless. And of course, because service can always be better. I mean, there's a funny, kind of fuzzy zone where ethical decisions are kind of grotesque against the greater good when limited resources is the name of the game. Who gets the lung transplant? Who doesn't? What services should the NHS provide? Can it provide? Ought it provide? Can it afford to provide? All tricky stuff. But to be clear, for all its criticisms, it is an amazing institution. And I make warning now, once it's gone in these modern times, it ain't never coming back. So how do you make the NHS fail on paper so that you can justify regime change? Surely by now you have the Machiavellian answer. Come on, it's the same thing. You're a private company or a foreign country whose economy is in the shitter and is on the turning point of a housing crash the size of 2008 and a stock correction with 0% base interest rates. The only thing left to do is to be printing dollars like mad, the effect of which will devalue the dollar to a point where foreign countries eventually see it worthwhile buying those treasury bonds. And while I'm at it, you might imagine what would happen to the US economy if countries like Syria, Iran, Iraq ceased trading oil in USD, but say in yen or rubles. Indeed, the value of rubles drop when US does an airstrike on Syria. More dollar, y'all. But look over there. a nice juicy NHS to consume and replace worth $160 billion a year. What did we say earlier about usurping the incumbent and redirecting cash flows, then providing a similar service at lower cost but keeping the tax rate the same? See what I'm saying? Except when it comes to healthcare, prices are inelastic. So if you are the only medical show in town, people have to pay whatever the rate is or die. And we can't imagine that the same service is provided for the same price when profit also has to be extracted from the equation. Either price has to go up or quality comes down, or more likely both. Triangles of success, formerly of the Disney Imagineering. Remember the triangles we talked about in the last couple of videos? Quality, price, or was it schedule, time? Now, consider then bringing in the bureaucrats and the time and motion people who set arbitrary benchmarks in terms of performance and metrics that are actually good indicators of fiscal performance but have little to do with actual healthcare benefit, as it's actually difficult to measure quality of life objectively. So here's what you do. You constantly revise up or set ridiculous benchmarks so that the health system never reaches these goals, never obtains those metrics. Oh gosh, look, we can say NHS is failing to meet benchmarks. Oh, obviously, therefore it doesn't represent good value for money. We're spending all this money on it and not getting the results. Oh, it fails to meet standards. Again and again. And then we get the press to repeat this message. Crumbling NHS fails patients, costs a fortune, doesn't meet benchmarks, because they keep putting the benchmarks up. It's a bit on defunding. It's a PR job, and the people come to believe, well, the lie. And with that, justification is made for handing the system to a private corporation. And that corporation has significant funding and rich friends in the government at the right places, and for some strange reason, it suddenly gets deregulated right after privatisation. Or those benchmarks just suddenly come down for no apparent reason. Success is all but guaranteed. We made some people rich, killed lots of others, and devalued a critical piece of infrastructure. And I've no doubt we shall read about the suicides going up as they once did in times when people who couldn't afford private healthcare didn't want to financially burden the family. You'll see, perish the thought, you may already know such a person. And we need only look to the US and the deregulation of the pork industry. Now corporations self-monitor to standards they think suitable. It's a bit like making the guilty party or the charged the jury. Crazy. Why would you do that? Anyway, so these lines, the pork lines, were monitored by government inspectors, and the lines were limited to a specific speed, such that at least a cursory glance was possible. Now the companies can set their own line speed such that not even cursory glances are possible. Imagine the question as one hog whisks past an inspector in less than a quarter of a second. Did you see anything wrong with that? Yes or no? Well, of course not. It went by too. Good, so you didn't see anything wrong. That's all that matters, and the hog passes because it's impossible to say that there were any defects. And lo and behold, the number of hogs passing quality assurance goes up. A miracle! Hailed as a new innovation in quality control. Yeah, anyway, back to Machiavelli and the requirement for good laws. Good armies, or civic armies, dressed in thinly disguised paramilitary uniforms, and maybe we call them police service rather than enforcement officers, to protect and serve. But it doesn't say who. Yeah, I know, but whatever. Yeah, there are crazy bastards out there that would do harm, and I guess the police is a real shitty job because you get it from all sides. Yeah, so I'm going to leave that one alone. Of course it's difficult. But in terms of private army, to protect the interests of the prince and the establishment, Machiavelli cautions against mercenaries for all sorts of reasons, mostly their lack of ideological attachment, that the highest bidder wins their expertise and application. I don't know of any mercenaries. I think I knew one. Some funny, bizarre conversations with a chap who died now, unfortunately. He was my best mate at school too. Cancer got him. Been all over the world doing all sorts of naughty things. Yeah, but Machiavelli suggests that mercenaries suffer the same defect as the citizenry that promises to lie down their lives in defence of their prince, but only when there's no real risk of that happening. Likewise, mercs will take the paycheck and promise all sorts of things until they have to go and do that thing, and actually do the dying bit. They do all the soldiering until war actually comes. Machiavelli points out the impossible position of using mercs. A really excellent mercenary captain will have ideas of his own. A mercenary captain who is not excellent is only a liability under military operations and not desirable at all. Neither is a choice. So the suggestion here is that the army must comprise of the citizenry, specially trained, of course, and by training I mean restrained by rules, chains of command and restricted authority. We can't have them developing ideas of their own. A strictly enforced chain of command, a useful tool in modern times in regulation and limitation by insurance, that if any officer does take upon himself to operate outside the guidelines and regulations, he does so with full personal, commercial, unlimited liability. He's going to lose his house, whereby a claim is made against him which his corporation does not cover his liability. The insurance provider will naturally want assurances about competency, so we can develop agreed training and certification, insurance, all that. And this is how we come into these superstructures of control. Insurance, mortgages, a massive chunk of the world economics. That's a huge superstructure of control. Some by design, some by accident. The law of unintended consequences of all that is messy. One conspiracy theorists are quick to jump in on. If only it were that simple. Worse than using mercenaries, though, is to use someone else's troops. Back in the day, third-party troops who won might just keep their prize and turn on you. Fight battles with your own troops. In some regard, the thinking is it's better to lose with your own troops than win with somebody else's. Machiavelli then changes from the theoretic and so-called soft skills of management, as it were, to the hardcore realities of environment. This applies to business too. The dedication is to war, that's it. At some time, you will start a war, or face one instigated by another. You should know your warcraft. Diplomacy, the preferred route, of course, but for the human condition and failure to reach diplomatic agreement, war. If you are in command, you must know warfare. You must understand it. Again, if you do not, you will fear it and fold. Machiavelli warns, it's never avoided, only deferred until a time of choosing. As hinted, the generational and institutional knowledge contained in the personal histories of diplomats and international negotiators offers an opinion of the other, in great measure, from what he is and what he does, rather than from what we might imagine he is if we have no context of our enemy. Remove this layer of expertise at your peril. Refinement and cultural sophistication is all well and good, and for the pleasantries, there will be few times for its use. But, warns Mackie, if you falter with these pleasantries, so be it. It's embarrassing. Fail at war and you die. Lose the kingdom and the serf gets killed too. Be armed. To do anything less is contemptible. In business, I suppose that means be dangerous. Maybe this is what Jordan Peterson was blathering on about. It's posturing, sure. Best lawyers, best accountants, best finance, best sales team and so on. We've heard this, I'm sure. Hire only A's. B's will bring in and hire sub-B's who will bring in and hire C's, and then you're fucked because A's will only hire in A's and bring A-plus players. Yeah, this being armed thing, it's a power thing. It's very difficult for an armed man to think of a good reason why he ought to take orders from an unarmed man. It's also unreasonable for an unarmed man to assume he's safe among his armed servants or contemporaries. It shows a misunderstanding, and it raises questions, and where there's doubt, there is no doubt. We've kind of seen this a little bit recently where, in business found power and black turtleneck wearing Zoomers have raised billions and burned it all on private jets, follies and drugs, and sensibly investment capital is now being redirected back to, capitalists, not well-dressed pleasantries. At least posturing demonstrates an understanding of what the real thing looks like, and I suppose it's all that mutually assured destruction is all about. Appropriate acronym too. The question at the back of your mind is the other guy really crazy enough to push the mad button? Now, acting crazy and irrational as a posture has some advantage, but it also makes people very nervous and installs doubt, and this is how commercial airliners get shot down. So let's be clear. Violence, war, is the means by which our adversary is compelled to submission, and to obtain this goal, that enemy must be disarmed. And disarmament of the enemy then becomes the first immediate goal. What message is the unarmed prince sending? The prince has to be hardened. Too much drink, too much food, soft pillows and easy options form bad habits of taking the easy option. It's all part of the conditioning. Be hardened, be physically strong, mentally strong, then go out to the land and learn it. learn the nature of the terrain. Machiavelli was specifically talking about bushcraft, the lay of the land, what valleys mean, how water flows through them, where would a convenient supply route be, where's the high ground, where would you set up camp for 10,000 men, where would the enemy do it, what are the signs of enemy presence, how can a place be attacked or defended. Yeah, it's the SWOT analysis. In business, it's the economic conditions, customer sentiment, interest rates, employment rate, mortgage default rates, yield curves, and all the other risks that feed into your cost and value chain, and what other rational actors in your space will do as a consequence. And speaking of reactions and responses, I realised I didn't finish off the story about the Bushmen and the monkeys who were trapped by use of a rock salt tied to a tree under heat and sunlight for a few hours with nothing but a rock salt to lick on. Of course they're going to get very thirsty, and then all you have to do is unleash them from the tree and keep up. They're going straight to their water supply. Machiavelli says it's critical to know how to spot the enemy and, by inference of their position, be able to reasonably conclude their strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats, and then best mobilise your own troops, organise for battle and besiege towns and corporations to your advantage. Machiavelli talks about playing war games, what-if scenarios, the decision trees and strategies planned out ahead of time, contingency upon contingency, such that as the day comes, the plan is already in place and all that's left is execution. We've said it before, as Buffett has, designing the plan or contingency while under heavy emotional load or stress is a recipe for disaster. Yeah. Don't get that credit line today when you don't need it. Form alliances today when you don't need to. Make appreciation of somebody in your life today. Keep that bond today. There was one story I remember. I think it was a guy who invented DocStock. I can't remember the dude's name now. Was it Jason something? He got his crowdfunding from his university days. I think he said that he got to know either 100 people or 1,000 people during his 3 or 4 years at university. Some of them faculty, some of them other friends. And when he left university and wanted to start a tech firm, he just tapped those 1,000 people for $100 each. There's the 100,000 seed capital. So yeah, Machiavelli says do it ahead of time. This way you have a cure ready at the first sign of ills rather than having to borrow excessive funds because you don't know how much you're going to need and it's never going to be enough. And because it's short term and under desperation, any lender will see what's happening and will charge you a rate that sees your empire in technical default and at the flick of a court-appointed trustee's pen, handed to the bank. Doing the former then is strategic alliances with money men, money women, experts in the field, other power brokers, all the resources you're going to need. It's much more mutually advantageous rather than begging for aid in a conflict which, if victorious, will see you forever indebted. Of course, what extends out of this is it's often cheaper to learn from other people's mistakes. Read history. I'm sure this is obvious advice. In business, that's biographies, financial scandals. Gosh, so many to choose from. American Greed. I love that show. Actually, history too, international relations, Cold War, Hot War, Vietnam War. How was conflict resolved? How did it start? What are the warning signs? How were wars won and lost? What deeds were done? What were the prevailing conditions? Never be idle in times of peace. Be ready for when opportunity arises in all of its guises. And opportunity is all around us. It's everywhere. We don't even see it. I think we're only limited by our perception filters. That's what I liked about Bob Iger's book. Think bigger than that. Just, mind you, sometimes, I don't know, I struggle with this as well. Sometimes I've got pretty big thoughts and then people say, oh, that's cloud cuckoo land. You need to bring your thoughts down to reality. It's like, well, where? At what point is it too big and what point is it too small? Yeah. So yeah, if you are an INTJ type, you will know that there is a distance between how one lives and how one ought to be living. And I've struggled for a long time to find grounding, head in the clouds and all that. All up in my head about concepts and what could be without any real practical or known strategy of getting there. Well, that's not always true. I mean, I have fair ideas about how to get there sometimes at night. It's just so clear and obvious, but it's persuading other people. It's aligning all those assets. It's getting all the ducks in a row, convincing other people that it's going to work. It does seem one of the strange paradoxes of human nature. It's I always think of the bees, and the bees are a brilliant example. So you got these bees, or ants, I think maybe, they go out into the environment and bring back food to the hive, and they leave these trails, and I don't know whether it's necessarily on purpose or it's just when an ant goes, it leaves a pheromone trail because that's what an ant smells like. And so you get these pathways of pheromones that other ants follow because another ant went there, and obviously went there for a good reason, so they follow these paths, find food, bring it back to the hive or the nest or whatever. You might imagine over time those pathways to those foods, the food gets exhausted. But then what? Well, it turns out there's this crazy batshit 20% that are deranged and either can't or won't follow pheromone trails and go off in random directions and just so happen to stumble into new food sources. And then another ant picks up on the whiff of where they've just come from or their pheromone trail, and it's new and it's fresh, and they go that way, and then the old trails are not trodden so much, so their pheromones presumably erode and new pathways are established, and that's how it happens. I mean, that's probably really simplistic, but there seems to be a very small percentage of the human population that has a particular mindset, visionaries. And then there's the large percentage, 20-30%, that don't want change. There's also seems to be a very small subset that have an aptitude towards critical thinking, and the majority seem to go on, more kind of an emotional decision strategy. Yeah. I believe him, I trust him, and I don't want to say blindly follow because that's a bit disparaging, but it makes sense in lack of any other tools. So if you're not predisposed to critical thinking, or you just don't have experience to those tools, or it's just not in your repertoire, you're going to go to another preferred method of making decisions, and that is, what does the crowd say? Where does everyone else go? And here we are. Does it pass the smell test? And there's pros and cons. Working it out for yourself, getting all the data, building up a skill set to be able to discern what it all means. It's a big ask. Who's got time for that? And this is, Kahneman talked about it, didn't he? Type 1 thinking, type 2 thinking. That type 2 thinking is slow, precise, probably advantageous in economics, but type 1 thinking, it changes the question to a more approximate question, which isn't actually the question that was asked, but because the question's bastardized a little bit, it makes coming up with an answer a little bit easier. That's not quite right for the question asked, but good enough for survival, but hopeless in economics. It's what's that famous one? It's the bat and the ball, isn't it? If a bat and a ball costs £1.05, and the bat costs $1 more than the ball, how much does the ball cost? The kind of fast answer is the ball must cost 5 pence. Close enough that it's going to make a material difference, but if you times that error by 100,000 shares, you're going to lose a lot of money. Correct answer is 2.5p. Yeah, anyway, I get obsessed about it, can't stop thinking about it sometimes. It's so far away from grounded reality, it takes me a few weeks to come out of it, and then I'll lay down with a headache over a weekend, and when I wake up and read my mad ramblings and notes, I'll think, what lunatic wrote that? I need to get out more. Machiavelli has a message for those who abandon the now and what is, what was, what has been done for what could have been or should have been. Your life will flash by. Yeah. Idealism. And wanting to do only good deeds will be ruinous. Occasionally, bad things need undertaking. We must learn how to be bad and use this skill according to necessity. Chastising people, firing people, destroying people, making the hard decisions to close a now non-viable business, putting people out of work, or to have no qualms about squeezing investors to the limits of their credit rating. In reality, it is messy, and the prince may be praised or admonished for acts, both good and bad, but not even necessarily respectively. The prince will be judged regardless. You owe no one an explanation. Why continue to do so when those to whom you're explaining things do not have the context or reference or capacity to understand it anyway? People will judge. Mean, generous, kind, cruel, serious, frivolous, and maybe so. These judgments may be correct, but mostly they will not be. But through all that, the prince must be sensitive to which will affect the state of things, quite different from being sensitive to personal criticism. Of course, it's good to be thought of as generous, but generous is a state of imbalance. If you give to yourself as much as you give to others, This is self-serving and not virtuous, just indulgent, and then it becomes a vice. Being indulgent in generosity will normalise and require increasing displays of generosity, which will lead to the acquirement of wealth by, say, more taxation on those recently so gifted. This will not go unnoticed, and that downward spiral could be calamitous. Mackie advises those aspiring to be princess to certainly be generous, but when in office, to be a tight-fisted bastard. Be frugal, but be generous when it comes to the spoils of war. After all, it's not your wealth, nor the wealth of your subjects that you're giving away. Of course, be generous then. In short, don't piss off the citizenry, don't be hated, and never put yourself in a position of being despised. Contempt is a short step away, and violence usually follows quickly from contempt. And the big question that many have pondered, and the one perhaps best known for its attribution to the question of Machiavellian behaviour, is it better to be loved than feared? Compassion and cruelty, this is the crux of the Machiavellian behaviour. Regardless of the situation, and whether the prince is compassionate or cruel, the perception of being compassionate is obviously preferable. And of course, if the situation permits, then do so. The goal, as always, is to maintain power and loyalty of the subjects. It's a little bit fascistic. Law and order sometimes requires the example of what happens to undesirable behaviour. This is that being cruel to be kind thing. Severe punishment for heinous crimes committed against the state or the prince will keep good order for the benefit of everyone. It just does no good to be compassionate and lenient with those who murder and plunder. The point must be made. Such acts injure the state and the public at large. Yet an execution or two injures only the individuals concerned. It's for the greater good, you see, and that's another one of those perception things. Who exactly is the public? It's one of those useful covers, nebulous things. We can say that the public doesn't like X, Y, and Z, or blame the public for this or that. But the public, strangely, never complains. It's individuals that complain, or make trouble, or do good. So this facade of the public can be used almost without consequence to support any cause. On the flip side, and in the case of an unpopular or disastrous decision by the prince, he may highlight and focus in on a single individual and an exceptional case of success or advantage within the population, and he can focus his PR engine on that particular instance and then frame that as typical of what's going on. Propaganda 101, a deliberate distortion. People fill in the gaps and make the false correlation. In populations where millions will suffer due to incompetent management, there will be the exceptional 5 or 6 that do well under those prevailing conditions. Find them, promote them, show everyone else how good things are. Some might believe it. We've talked about the 20% and the 80%, and perception is everything. It's only the minority of critical thinkers that will spot it, and, well, they're the minority. Brexit Film Factory, eh, Boris? Yeah, let's see. Short-term distractions over the long term. Crowdfunders for ringing Big Fucking Ben, or Trump's famous comment on the TPP and how it's going to rape us. Then what happens? The news cycle focuses in on this minutiae, the outrage of using such language. The news stations get people in the studio who have been raped to talk about why that comment was so offensive. Again, outrage. But because it's so tangential, it doesn't change anything. It's almost as though if the real stories are too big to handle, and so bite-sized micro non-controversies are dramatised and serialised. It's exhausting, and I think maybe the point. And then we forget to ask, TPP, trade deal, is that good or bad? TPP, what is that? Instead it just becomes a signal boost to the person who made the outrageous remark. Well, there's a response to that too. Where are my Twitter army at? As mentioned before, newly installed princes face unseen and unknowable dangers from legacy institutions. Make an example then of those first early crimes during your new reign. You must not get a reputation as an easy pushover. However, injustice must be seen to be applied. I think we've mentioned before the components of justice, that it has to apply to all equally, that it's applied consistently, and that it is administered equally and without prejudice and legitimacy, i.e. those affected by the matter get a say. The prince must be trusting but not too trusting, the prince must be suspicious but not too suspicious. Of course, the idea is to be both loved and feared. If this is not possible, choose feared. It's the gain-pain thing. People are much more sensitive and reactive to loss than gain, and what do they gain from love compared to what they will suffer in loss? I'm sure this comes as no great surprise. I'm sure we've all seen it. People would pay anything for the dream, But the harsh truth, even at a penny, is too expensive. Greedy and ungrateful, fickle. Of course, we can't blame them. Circumstances change. And customers are free to go to other suppliers and companies and will eventually put resources and price above loyalty. They may even get better service and attention elsewhere. It's the way of things. While the citizen or customer or shareholders get benefit from your stewardship, they will be loyal and forgive a few indiscretions. As stated before, they will promise you their lives to protect yours, while the probability of such is remote, and where they benefit by this promise. Yet, when the conditions change, so will their promise, somehow retrospectively. Do not depend on their promise. It will never come. Bind them if you can. We see this with all sorts of nasty contracts. Look no further than the X Factor or reality TV contracts. You sign away everything for years, and the producers can use that footage in any way, at any time, for any reason, to make you look bad, stupid, clever, or a magnificent unicorn beast, if it pleases the audience. And Simon Cowell is a prince in that world. Yeah, I must get around to reading his biography too. I've got it kicking around somewhere. It's so cool. I don't mean to be rude, but and then the one Tom Bauer wrote. I like Tom Bauer. No Angel was great. What was it? Sweet Revenge, The Intimate Life of Simon Cowell. So, let me ask, is Simon Cowell cruel? Did that hurt him or work to his advantage? More specifically, it's his producers that contrive the wannabes. They will tell them that Simon had a quick look at their early performance. It's just lacking a little bit, but if only they came out and really went for it, unrestrained, go for it, he thinks they might just be a winner. Of course, this is the job of the producer. Sensation TV over and above the dignity of the contestants. Mind you, anyone who's okay with signing away all rights forever, however many years, is okay with it, I guess. Whether Simon Cowell has instructed the producers to do this or not, well, that's it, isn't there? There is a distance of plausible deniability, and if it goes too far, Cowell can show all the compassion in the world in front of the cameras. Yes, exactly. He is feared, indeed, and loved. He seems to have mastered it then. Does he have the reputation of being occasionally compassionate? Yeah, sure. And has he wickedly punished those out of line? People are less inclined to cross someone they fear than to cross someone they love. Bought loyalty is never really owned, but a tool of leverage for the time that it is rented. Consider the contract that has hefty penalty clauses. If they perform on the contract, they get their reward. The obligations and duties are exchanged. Yet, without the hefty or else clause, when interests change or circumstances change, many would simply walk away from the obligation as there's no consequence. So ensure that or else is both there and enforceable. Check with your lawyer. Did I mention to get the best lawyers? And by the way, if you do it right, you're not paying for them either.